4 hours from execution, a 45-year-old former Marine sat alone in a freezing federal prison still wearing the old brown leather jacket he'd been arrested in. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for a priest. He asked to see his German shepherd. One last time. What no one expected was what the dog would do inside that cell. The moment those prison doors opened, the shepherd froze, then growled at the jacket like it remembered something no human ever noticed. Within hours, a buried secret would surface, and a man already sentenced to die would face a truth no courtroom had ever heard. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter pressed down on Wyoming like a held-breath snow clinging to the black pines surrounding Iron Ridge Federal Penitentiary, muting the world into something cold and watchful. Inside cell 218, Michael Turner sat motionless on the edge of a steel-framed bed, his boots planted flat on the concrete floor, as if he were bracing for impact. At 45, Michael carried the weight of a life lived hard, and stripped bare, tall, broad-shouldered, his body still solid beneath the years, his face cut with sharp angles, and a permanent roughness that no prison routine had softened. A short graying beard traced his jaw, his dark hair cropped close out of habit rather than regulation, and his eyes, once steady and commanding in uniform, now held a quiet, disciplined exhaustion that came from years of being unheard. He was still wearing the old, dark brown leather jacket, thick and scarred with age, the kind that creaked faintly when he moved layered over a red and navy flannel shirt. A gray wool scarf was wrapped tightly around his neck, not for warmth, but for familiarity, for the comfort of routine learned in colder places and worse winters. No one had required him to wear it today. He had insisted. Because that jacket was the last thing Buddy had touched the night everything fell apart. Michael's hands rested loosely on his thighs, fingers scarred and strong hands that once carried wounded men out of snowstorms and gunfire, now empty and waiting. The clock above the cell door ticked toward morning, each second landing with the dull certainty of a verdict already delivered. Michael Turner had been convicted of murdering Richard Cole, a powerful Colorado real estate magnate whose name carried weight in courtrooms and boardrooms alike. The evidence had been clean enough to satisfy a jury, a partial fingerprint on a knife, a financial dispute manufactured into motive witnesses who remembered raised voices but not faces. No one cared that Michael had served over 20 years as a Marine. No one cared that he had never been arrested before. In the end, he had fit the shape of guilt too well, a large, quiet man with a military past and a temper shaped by war. Michael did not rage at the injustice anymore. Rage took energy, and energy was something he conserved now like breath in deep water. When Warden Elaine Brooks stopped outside his cell, her posture straight and professional, Michael lifted his gaze without surprise. Brooks was in her late 50s, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back tight, her face lined not with cruelty, but with long exposure to final days. She was efficient, controlled, known for fairness within the limits of the system she enforced. "Mr. Turner," she said evenly, "you're entitled to one final request. Within reason." Michael swallowed once, feeling the familiar pressure in his chest. Not fear exactly, but something quieter and heavier. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not ask for a priest. He did not even ask to make a phone call. His voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "I want to see Buddy," he said. "My dog." Something flickered behind Brooks's eyes before it vanished. A hesitation, a calculation. "The German shepherd," she said. Michael nodded. "He's all I've got left." Brooks studied him for a long moment, the jacket, the scarf, the way he sat, as if still on duty somewhere. Finally, she turned away. "I'll make the call," she said, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the corridor. Hundreds of miles north, in a small Montana town pressed up against a forest of evergreens, Sarah Turner's phone rang before dawn. Sarah was 38, lean and tall, with pale skin that freckled easily in summer, and dark blonde hair usually tied back in a loose knot that matched her practical nature. Years of living in cold places had given her a quiet resilience, the kind that showed in how she stood and how she listened. She wore grief the way some people wore coats, always present, always heavy but functional. When she answered the phone, she listened without interrupting, her jaw tightening as the words settled in. "Execution," the voice said. Sarah did not cry. She rarely did anymore. She hung up, pulled on her boots, and stepped out onto the porch where Buddy lay curled near the door. Buddy was a 9-year-old German shepherd, large even for his breed, his black and tan coat dusted white with fresh snow. A long scar ran across his muzzle, giving his face a permanently weathered look, and his amber eyes opened the moment Sarah approached. Buddy had been a forest rescue dog, once trained to find the lost and the buried, to move without hesitation into storms where others turned back. For 6 years, he had waited. Sarah clipped the leash to his collar, her hands steady despite the storm inside her chest. "We're going," she said softly. Buddy rose without sound, snow sliding from his back, as if he already knew. Back in Iron Ridge, Michael sat alone again, listening to the distant hum of the building waking up. He thought of Buddy standing watch at the cabin door, of the weight of the dog pressed against his legs on nights when sleep refused to come. He thought of that last night, the shouting, the sirens, Buddy's teeth closing on the hem of this very jacket, as if trying to hold him in place. The corridor door opened. Michael lifted his head. Footsteps echoed toward him, slow and deliberate against the cold concrete. He could not tell whether they belonged to his dog or to the men who would walk him out for the last time. The sound stopped just outside his cell. The lock clicked. The screen cut to black. A pale winter sun struggled through low clouds as the highway cut across Wyoming snow, sweeping sideways over the asphalt and blurring the horizon into a single moving shade of white. Sarah Turner kept both hands steady on the wheel, her posture upright, despite the hours already etched into her shoulders. She drove the way she lived, carefully, deliberately, never wasting motion. At 38, Sarah was tall and lean, her frame shaped by years of outdoor work and cold climates, her skin pale with a faint scattering of freckles across her cheeks. Her dark blonde hair was pulled into a simple tie at the nape of her neck, strands escaping to brush against a face that carried quiet resolve rather than softness. Grief had sharpened her, not broken her, and those who knew her understood she was not a woman who collapsed when pressure came. Buddy lay in the back seat, his large German shepherd body braced against every curve of the road, amber eyes, alert ears shifting at sounds Sarah could barely hear. At 9 years old, Buddy's movements were slower than they once had been, his joints stiff in the cold, but his presence filled the vehicle with an unmistakable readiness, as if this drive were another search mission and not a farewell. As the miles passed, Sarah's thoughts drifted backward, pulled by memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. Michael Turner had found Buddy 6 years earlier in a small rescue shelter outside Boise, Idaho, a place filled with noise and desperation and animals labeled too difficult to love. Buddy had been kept in an isolated pen at the back, a warning sign taped to the chain-link fence: aggressive, unadoptable, not suitable for families. Michael had stood in front of that pen longer than any other, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. At 40, then still newly discharged from the Marines, Michael carried war in his posture, tall, heavy-boned, his movements controlled as if chaos were always one breath away. His beard had been darker back then, his eyes sharper, but even in those days, there was a distance behind them, something pulled inward and guarded. The shelter worker, a tired man with hollow eyes and hands that shook from too many goodbyes, had warned him. "That one's trouble," he'd said. "Doesn't like people, doesn't listen." Michael had crouched anyway, lowering himself until his eyes met Buddy's through the fence. The dog had stared back without barking, without retreating, scarred muzzle lifted in defiance rather than fear. Michael had spoken softly, almost to himself. "Yeah," he'd said. "They said that about me too." Buddy had not moved, but something in his gaze had shifted like recognition. That was how it began. After the Marines, Michael's life had been a battlefield of its own. PTSD followed him into civilian life with a persistence no therapy had managed to quiet. There were nights when he woke, gasping, his hands clenched, as if still gripping a rifle, his mind trapped in moments that refused to stay buried. He was not violent with others, but with himself. Yes, rage turned inward discipline, breaking into panic. Buddy had learned those rhythms quickly. When the episodes came, Buddy would press his full weight across Michael's chest, a living anchor breathing slow and steady, until Michael's heartbeat matched it. More than once, Sarah had watched from the doorway as a man trained for war was brought back to the present by a dog deemed too dangerous to trust. The prison gates loomed ahead, now steel and concrete, cutting into the landscape like an open wound. Iron Ridge Federal Penitentiary stood cold and immovable, its walls rising from the snow as if the land itself had rejected it. Sarah parked where instructed and stepped out into the biting wind, her breath visible in sharp bursts. Buddy exited the vehicle carefully, his paws sinking into fresh snow. The moment they crossed the outer perimeter, his body changed. His back straightened, his ears locked forward, his nose lifted, drawing in the air with quick, precise breaths. He was not afraid. He was alert. Inside, fluorescent lights replaced daylight, and the smell of disinfectant and metal pressed in from all sides. A corrections officer escorted them through a series of locked doors, his uniform crisp, his expression neutral. He glanced at Buddy with professional caution, but said nothing. Sarah felt the weight of every second ticking away, each door closing behind them, with a finality that echoed in her chest. When they reached the visitation corridor, Sarah knelt briefly beside Buddy, her gloved hand resting against his thick fur. "Easy," she whispered, though she wasn't sure whether she meant him or herself. The door opened. Michael Turner stood on the other side. For a fraction of a second time, stopped. Michael looked older than Sarah remembered, his beard, now streaked with gray, his face leaner lines etched deep by years of confinement. But he stood straight, shoulders squared inside that same brown leather jacket, the red and navy flannel visible beneath the gray scarf wrapped tight around his neck. His eyes locked onto Buddy's. Buddy froze, then surged forward with a sound that tore itself from his chest, a broken whine, raw and desperate. Sarah barely had time to release the leash before Buddy crossed the room and threw himself against Michael, his full weight slamming into the man as if afraid he might vanish. Michael staggered, then dropped to one knee, his arms coming around Buddy, instinctively burying his face into the dog's fur. He did not speak. He could not. Buddy pressed closer, whining, licking Michael's face, his body trembling violently as though the last 6 years had collapsed into this single moment. Guards looked away, discomfort flickering across hardened faces. Sarah stood, frozen tears streaming freely now, her hands clasped together to keep from reaching for them both. Then Buddy stopped. His movement slowed, his nose lifted. He pressed it firmly against Michael's brown leather jacket, inhaling deeply again and again. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a bark, not a threat, but something warning and deliberate. Buddy began to growl very softly, eyes fixed, body tense. Michael felt it immediately, the shift, the instinct he trusted more than reason. His hands stilled against Buddy's back. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Buddy did not look at him. He did not move away. He kept his nose pressed to the jacket and growled again, quiet and controlled, as if remembering something no one else could see. The wind rattled the bare branches outside the small ranch house as dawn crept slowly across the plains, the Wyoming sky pale and exhausted, as if it too had not slept. Inside, Detective James Holloway stood in his cluttered home office, coffee gone cold in his hand, eyes burning from nights without rest. At 52, Holloway looked like a man worn down by decades of unanswered questions. He was tall, but stooped slightly now, his shoulders permanently slanted forward as if the weight of old cases still pressed on him. His hair, once dark, had faded into a coarse mix of gray and ash, and his beard was thick, uneven, the kind grown not for style, but because shaving had slipped low on the list of priorities. His face was angular, deeply lined, especially around the eyes that had seen too much certainty turn out wrong. Holloway had been a detective for nearly 30 years, known among his peers as thorough, relentless, and stubborn to a fault. He believed in procedure, believed in evidence, believed that if you followed the trail long enough, it would tell you the truth. That belief had cracked once before, years ago, when a rushed arrest led to an innocent man spending a decade in prison. Holloway had carried that failure quietly ever since. Now, as the execution of Michael Turner loomed closer by the hour, that old fracture had reopened. Michael Turner was Holloway's case. He had been the one to put the cuffs on him. Holloway had remembered Michael clearly, tall, silent eyes, steady even as his life collapsed around him. No pleading, no outburst. Just a man who looked Holloway straight in the face and said, "You're making a mistake." Holloway had ignored it then. He told himself the evidence was solid. He told himself doubt was a luxury detectives could not afford. Yet here he was nights later, unable to sleep, standing before a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in years. He pulled the Montgomery file from the drawer and spread its contents across the desk. Crime scene photos, witness statements, financial records. Everything that had once felt airtight now looked disturbingly neat, like a story polished too smooth. Holloway flipped through until he found what had woken him at 3 a.m, a supplemental forensic report attached to the original lab findings. The stamp across the top read, "Not required for court presentation." His jaw tightened. The report detailed trace gunshot residue found on surfaces near the victim. Gunpowder. Holloway stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Richard Cole, wealthy developer, political donor man found dead in his Colorado penthouse, had been killed by a knife. No firearm, no discharge. Gunshot residue made no sense. Holloway rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion giving way to something sharper. Why hadn't this been raised? He scanned the authorization line. A signature from the district attorney's office. Approved. Closed. Holloway pushed back from the desk and paced the room, boots scuffing the floor. He reopened the case logs, cross-checking timelines, and noticed something else that hadn't bothered him before a cluster of phone pings near the penthouse, the night of the murder numbers that had been flagged as irrelevant during the original investigation. One number appeared repeatedly, always close, always brief. Holloway traced it through archived call records until it landed on a name he didn't recognize. Ethan Cross. He paused, then dug deeper. Cross was not listed as a witness. He had never testified. His name never appeared in court transcripts. Yet Holloway's instincts flared as he uncovered Cross's background. Ethan Cross was 46, well-dressed, clean-cut, known in certain circles as a risk consultant. In reality, he was a fixer, a man hired by wealthy clients to make inconvenient problems disappear quietly. Cross operated in the margins of legality, never directly tied to crimes, always one step removed. Holloway leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Richard Cole had enemies. Business rivals, political ties, land deals worth millions. Michael Turner, by contrast, had been a convenient shape former Marine security consultant, physically imposing, present at meetings where arguments could be overheard. Holloway felt the familiar weight of shame settle into his chest. Had he wanted the case to be simple? Had he let the narrative guide him instead of the facts? He glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:20 a.m. The number seemed to glare back at him. 100 minutes. That was all the time left before the state would strap Michael Turner to a gurney and call it justice. Holloway moved fast now, pulling files, snapping photos with his phone, dialing numbers that went unanswered. He called a former lab technician, a woman in her early 60s with careful hands and a habit of never deleting anything. She answered on the second ring. Gunshot residue, Holloway said, without preamble. From the Cole case. Why wasn't it pursued? There was a pause on the line, long enough to speak volumes. I was told it wasn't relevant, she said finally. Told to archive it. By who? Holloway asked. Another pause. You know I can't say that. Holloway hung up and swore under his breath. He pulled on his coat, the familiar weight grounding him, and stepped out into the cold. His breath fogged the air as he stood for a moment on the porch, fighting the urge to stand still and think. Thinking was dangerous now. Action was all that mattered. He dialed Iron Ridge as he walked to his truck. This is Detective James Holloway, he said when the line connected. I need to speak with the warden immediately. It's about Michael Turner. He ended the call and started the engine tires crunching against ice. As the truck rolled forward, Holloway felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope laced tightly with fear. Hope that he was not too late. Fear that he was. The snow began to fall again, light at first, then thicker, erasing tire tracks almost as quickly as they formed. Holloway tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead. The clock on the dashboard ticked forward. 8:24. Time like truth was running out. Snow drifted lazily across the prison yard as late morning light filtered through a sky the color of steel, the kind of cold that settled into bone and refused to leave. Inside Iron Ridge, Michael Turner sat on a narrow bench, shoulders slightly hunched, now exhaustion pressing down harder than fear ever had. Buddy had not moved from his side since the reunion. The German Shepherd's large frame was wedged close to Michael's leg, his weight solid and insistent, amber eyes tracking every breath Michael took. At 9 years old, Buddy's coat had dulled just enough to show age, black and tan fur threaded with gray along his neck and muzzle, but his focus remained razor sharp. He was not trembling. He was working. Michael felt it in the way Buddy leaned into him, the way his breathing changed whenever a guard passed, the way his paw kept returning to the hem of the brown leather jacket, as if drawn by a magnet. Buddy whined softly, low in his throat, then scratched at the jacket again, claws scraping leather with quiet urgency. Michael closed his eyes briefly, the sound cutting deeper than he expected. That jacket had carried him through winters, overseas, through nights sleeping in trucks and half-burned buildings. It smelled like oil, cold, and home. Buddy's behavior stirred something uneasy in Michael's chest, a pressure he had learned not to ignore. Easy, he murmured more to steady himself than the dog. Buddy did not ease. He pressed his nose firmly against the jacket, inhaling hard, then pawed again, tugging as if trying to pull it free from Michael's body. Across the room, Sarah Turner watched with growing dread. She stood rigid near the wall, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her tall, lean frame drawn inward as memories she had kept buried clawed their way back. Her pale skin looked almost translucent under the harsh light's freckles standing out against cheeks flushed by cold and stress. Dark blonde hair framed her face in loose strands, the rest tied back in a knot that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Sarah had always been observant, the kind of woman who noticed what others dismissed, and now her stomach tightened with recognition. "The night you were arrested?" she said quietly, her voice steady but thin. "He did the same thing." Michael opened his eyes and looked at her. "What do you mean?" Sarah swallowed. "He wouldn't leave you alone. He kept pawing at that jacket, whining, trying to pull it away. I thought he was panicking." Her gaze dropped to Buddy, whose attention had not wavered. But now, Michael followed her thought to its edge and felt the ground shift beneath him. What had Buddy known that night? What had he smelled? The memory rose, unbidden sirens cutting through the dark hands, forcing him to the ground. Buddy barking once sharp, furious before clamping his teeth onto the jacket, as if trying to anchor Michael in place. Michael had shouted for him to stop, had assumed fear and confusion drove the behavior. He had been wrong before. Meanwhile, miles away in a dim courthouse office, Detective James Holloway leaned over a desk, cluttered with files, his eyes red-rimmed and burning. The room smelled of stale coffee and old paper, the scent of unfinished work. Holloway's posture was tense, his tall frame bent forward, gray-streaked beard shadowing a face carved by decades of hard choices. He had not slept. He did not intend to. Papers lay spread before him like pieces of a puzzle that refused to stay hidden any longer. He had forced access to internal emails from the district attorney's office, combing through archived threads with a patience sharpened by desperation. The truth emerged slowly, then all at once. Evidence had not simply been overlooked, it had been buried. Requests from the prosecution to limit forensic disclosure. Instructions to exclude the supplemental gunshot residue report. Holloway felt his jaw clench until it ached. He dug deeper and uncovered financial disclosures tied to Richard Cole, the victim a web of land acquisitions, federal zoning exemptions, and shell companies that pointed unmistakably toward corruption at a scale far beyond a single murder. Cole had been preparing to expose it. That much was clear now. Whistleblower drafts sat half-finished on a seized laptop that had never made it into evidence. Emails flagged as privileged. Meetings scheduled with federal investigators. Cole had been planning to bring down powerful people. Holloway exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. Michael Turner had been the perfect substitute for the truth, a former Marine turned security consultant present near Cole's orbit, physically capable, publicly convenient. Holloway slammed his fist lightly against the desk, anger flaring hot and brief. He had believed the story because it had been easier than questioning the hands that shaped it. Back at Iron Ridge, Buddy's agitation escalated. He pawed harder now, a low rumble vibrating through his chest, not aggressive, but insistent, as if time itself were running out. A guard stepped closer, wary, but Michael raised a hand slightly, his voice calm. "He's trained," he said. "He's telling us something." The guard hesitated, then stepped back. Sarah's mind raced. If Buddy had reacted that way the night of the arrest, if he was reacting now, then whatever he sensed had not faded. It had waited. She thought of the cabin in Montana, the one place untouched by the investigation where Michael's things had remained exactly as he left them. "The bag," she said suddenly. Michael looked up. "What bag? Your old duffel," Sarah replied. The one you kept in the cabin. From before everything. Michael's brow furrowed. I haven't seen it since before the arrest, Sarah finished. Her heart pounded as certainty took shape. If something was planted on you, if Buddy smelled it, that bag might still carry it. The idea settled between them, heavy and electric. Buddy whined sharply, pawing once more at the jacket, as if in agreement. At the same moment, Holloway's phone buzzed. He answered without looking. I've got confirmation, said a voice on the other end, low and cautious. The prosecutor authorized evidence suppression. And Cole's land deals federal land. This goes higher than we thought. Holloway closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed resolve. Michael Turner was framed, he said, and I'm not letting this end the way they planned. He checked the time. Minutes were bleeding away. Back in the prison room, Michael rested his hand on Buddy's head, fingers sinking into familiar fur. You knew, he whispered. Buddy leaned into the touch eyes, never leaving the jacket, the past. The truth, only he seemed able to hold. Snow fell in long, quiet sheets over the courthouse steps as the morning bled toward noon, the sky low and colorless, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Inside the emergency hearing room, Michael Turner stood with his shoulders squared, the brown leather jacket hanging heavy on his frame. The gray wool scarf wrapped tight at his neck like a final shield against the cold. At 45, Michael looked older than the man who had walked into Iron Ridge 6 years earlier, yet there was something newly fragile in his eyes now, a guarded hope he had learned not to trust. His beard was trimmed short, flecked with gray, his face deeply lined, every angle sharpened by years of waiting for a truth that never came. Buddy sat at his side, the German shepherd's body pressed close to Michael's leg, his black and tan coat duller than it once was, his amber eyes alert but tired, as if the long vigil had finally taken its toll. Sarah Turner sat behind them, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, her tall, lean figure rigid with a tension she refused to release. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back, as always, her pale skin drawn tight across her cheekbones, eyes fixed on Michael with an intensity that bordered on fear. Across the room, Detective James Holloway stood near the wall, his tall frame, rigid, gray-streaked beard casting a shadow over a face worn by guilt and resolve in equal measure. He had not slept, and it showed, but there was clarity in his posture now, the posture of a man who had finally chosen a side. The judge entered without ceremony time, having stripped the moment of all ritual. Documents were presented quickly. Evidence once buried was laid bare. Suppressed reports, financial records, emails tied to land deals that stretched into federal jurisdiction. The prosecutor's objections faltered, then collapsed under their own weight. When the ruling came, it arrived not with drama but with devastating simplicity. Michael Turner's conviction was vacated. He was innocent. The words struck Michael like a physical blow. For a moment the room blurred sound draining away, as if the world had tilted too far in one direction. Sarah covered her mouth, a soundless sob shaking her shoulders. Holloway closed his eyes briefly, the tension draining from his spine as something long and heavy finally loosened its grip. But he did not bark. He did not move. He leaned harder against Michael's leg as if to say, "Stay here, stay with me." Outside the doors opened and Michael stepped into the cold air a free man. He did not remove the jacket. He did not loosen the scarf. He walked down the steps with Buddy at his side, snow collecting on the leather melting slowly, leaving darkened marks like tears. Reporters shouted questions he could not hear. Sarah reached him, her hands trembling as she touched his arm, then his face as if confirming he was real. Holloway watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, knowing redemption, if it came at all, would come slowly. Freedom, Michael learned quickly was not loud. It arrived quietly like snow settling into places he did not yet know how to inhabit. They returned to Montana under a sky that refused to clear the landscape, stretching wide and empty, the road cutting through drifts and frozen fields. Buddy lay in the back seat, breathing shallowly, his body stiff with fatigue. Michael kept glancing at the mirror, watching the rise and fall of the dog's chest, a knot forming in his stomach that had nothing to do with the past 6 years. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice low, controlled the way it became when she was bracing herself for something painful. She told him about the vet, about the tests, about the words that had followed. Late-stage cancer. Months, maybe less. Buddy had been living on borrowed time. Michael pulled the truck over without thinking, gravel crunching beneath the tires as he stepped out into the snow. The cold bit through his boots, but he barely felt it. He knelt beside Buddy, the German shepherd, lifting his head with effort, eyes soft but unwavering. Michael cupped the dog's scarred face in his hands, thumbs brushing fur thinned by age and illness. The realization hit him with brutal clarity. Buddy had held on. Through cold nights, through pain, through the slow betrayal of his own body, he had waited. For this, for Michael to walk free. Snow gathered on Michael's shoulders as he sank fully to his knees, the road empty, the world reduced to the space between him and the dog. His voice broke when he spoke the words barely more than breath. "I'm alive," he whispered. "Because of you." Buddy leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Michael's chest, a soft sound escaping him. Neither whine nor bark, but something intimate and final. Sarah stood a few steps away, tears streaming freely, now her hands pressed together, as if in prayer. She understood, as Michael did, that justice had arrived too late to be clean. They drove on the road, winding through forests heavy with snow, until the cabin came into view, small and dark against the white. Michael carried Buddy inside his arms, straining but uncomplaining, every step deliberate. Later, when the fire burned low and night pressed against the windows, Michael sat on the floor beside Buddy's bed, his hand resting on the dog's ribcage, counting each breath. The war had taught him how to say goodbye without words. Outside, the snow fell steadily, erasing tracks, softening edges, leaving the world quieter than it had ever been. On that long, empty road in Montana, freedom had finally come. It had simply asked for everything in return. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire. Sometimes they arrive quietly on 4 paws through loyalty that refuses to give up. Michael's freedom did not come from power, money, or influence. It came from truth, patience, and a love so faithful that it endured suffering in silence. Many of us go through life carrying unseen burdens, praying for answers that seem delayed or denied. But Scripture reminds us that God sees what we cannot, and He works even when the world has already passed judgment. In our daily lives, we may not face prison walls, but we all face moments when hope feels buried. Let this story remind you to hold on, to stay faithful, and to trust that no act of love is ever wasted in God's hands. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayer requests, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, loyalty, and redemption. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you always.